Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope you are all having a very nice day today. Continuing with my discussion of the works of Edward Yang, today, if you'll permit me, I would like to talk with you about a very interesting film directed by Edward Yang. The film is from 1996. The title of the film is Couples, also known as Mahjong. So this is the film Mahjong by Edward Yang. As I mentioned, it also is known under the title Couples. As you can see here, this is a DVD. This is a Japanese DVD release, and thus it has the film under the title Couples, as it was released here in Japan, as my understanding would have it. Unfortunately, this film is, as far as I can tell, out of print in any physical media release form, at least as of the time of this video. This is the Japanese DVD, but in fact, even this Japanese DVD is, as of now, out of print, and so it is not possible to get through official, ordinary distribution channels like retail and the like. So it might be a little bit of a difficult film to get one's hands on if one is looking to see this film on a DVD or physical media format. What is more, this particular DVD, which is the Japanese release, does not have any English language support in the form of English subtitles, for example. So the film is presented only with the option of having Japanese subtitles, which can be turned on or off at your wish. There are, of course, sections of the film that are in English, because there are English-speaking characters that are part of the tableau of the world that we see in this film Mahjong. So it's not like it's not like one needs to have English subtitles for the entirety of the film. But for most of the film, it is the English, the language that is spoken is not English. And so if you are even looking for this particular Japanese DVD, unfortunately, if you are in need of English language support, this is probably not the best place to go, this particular DVD. So, is this film available on streaming or not? I mean, that's a good question, and I would ask you out there, if anyone has any information about how one can see this film, one can view this film, please let me know. Please let us know, and I would be very interested in knowing more information about that. The reason why I ask is because I think this film is a very interesting one. It is a very memorable one, not only in the terms of the fact that it falls rather late in Edward Yang's short filmography. In fact, after this film, the film that appears in his filmography, in terms of his feature film filmography, is the film EE, which will be, unfortunately, his final film before his untimely passing. So this is, in many ways, his penultimate film. I don't know if it's therefore meant to be, I'm not sure if we can take it to be some kind of statement on life, per se, a kind of valedictory statement or anything like that, even to maybe a minor degree, perhaps. I don't know if we can even take it that far. It just so happens to fall within that particular filmography chronology. That being said, it is a work that I think is deserving of much attention, much critical scrutiny. There are many themes that are parallel with the other works of Edward Yang, I would argue. But at the same time, there is perhaps a reworking of those themes or a remeditation upon those themes that could be seen by many, and certainly seen by many in critical circles, to be perhaps a darker bent on themes that he has explored in the past, taking stories to a much more, let's say, a much more treacherous terrain, perhaps, albeit with comic touches and comedic tones and scenes of light comedy. It's not all light comedy, of course. This is a film that also has very serious consequences for its characters. Multi-layered, dense, rich. It is impactful. It is emotionally quite stirring, and it is moving. Is quite moving indeed. So, in that sense, it is a very typical Edward Yang film. It is the kind of mastery that we have come to expect from Edward Yang based on the films that he has made up to now. It is a modern story. It is a film set in modern Taiwan, Taipei. So we're dealing with city life, and we're dealing with youth, and we are dealing with a certain crust of the urban society, the modern day society. So in many ways it could be seen as being, on the one hand, ties to past works that Edward Yang has made with respect to youth and the trials and tribulations of youth, shall we say. We saw that, of course, in his excerpt for the film In Our Time. We also saw that on the fore, quite magnificently so, in the film A Brighter Summer Day. This film, Mahjong, also deals, as I mentioned, with the plight, if you will, the struggles, the malaise with respect to urban living, with respect to upper middle class living, perhaps. It is a little bit more complicated than that, and I hope to explain that in further detail in the second part of this video. But in this general sense of an exploration of city living, urban city living in modern day, now democratic Taiwan, we can see this perhaps also as being linked to past film explorations of a similar theme that we saw, for instance, in That Day on the Beach, Taipei Story, The Terrorizers, and also A Confusion. But as I suggested earlier, I would say that this film takes those themes and maybe turns into a direction that can be seen as being quite maybe cynical, dark, comic, yes, satirical, maybe, but ultimately quite tragic in many ways, and perhaps tragic for certain characters more than for others, perhaps. But still, there is an underlying sense of sadness and also unease, and also not knowing exactly where to go, a kind of aimlessness, if you will, that is either something that is welcomed by the characters or not. Who knows? There is therefore this sense of ambiguity and ambivalence that creates a kind of strong sense of introspection and deep thinking, which is so evident in many of Edward Yang's other films, of course. So here it is, I would argue, quite evident indeed. So this is a general impression of the film Mahjong, or Couples. And again, it's unfortunate that it is not more widely available than it currently is. I hope that such situation changes in the future, because this film is, as I say, quite deserving of as much attention as it can get. It is quite an interesting film, and it would be interesting to see how people feel that it stacks up to, let's say, the rest of Edward Yang's filmography, which is quite powerful. So this is the film Mahjong, or Couples. Now, with that in mind, my friends, I will talk now about specific aspects of this film. I urge you not to watch the rest of this video if you have not seen this film yet. I will be talking about spoilers. I will be talking about specific details of the film. And so if you have not seen the film yet, please stop this video, and please, it's very tough, I know, because as I say, this film is very hard to come by, but hopefully there might be information about how to watch this film, and if that's the case, and if you are able to catch this film, maybe there might be a showing of it in an Edward Yang retrospective in a theater somewhere, who knows. If you're able to catch this film, I suggest that you do, because this is, as I say, a really hard film to watch. It's a very difficult film to get one's hands on, so if you have the opportunity to watch it, I suggest that you go and watch it immediately. It's not that long, relatively speaking. It's 2 hours, and it's if you like other Edward Yang films, I think you will find much to like in the film Mahjong. So if the opportunity arises that you are able to watch this film, take advantage of that opportunity. I think you will find it a very rewarding experience indeed. So, okay, so therefore, I will now talk about this film in detail. So you can stop this video now, or if you don't mind being spoiled, please continue on. But as I said, from here on in, I will be talking about specific details with respect to Edward Yang's film, Mahjong, or Couples. Okay, you're still here, so that means you don't mind being spoiled, or you've already seen the film, and so therefore you and I might have a nice discussion, or I can hear your thoughts about this film, Mahjong. And oh boy, this is yet another example of a dense, richly layered, multi-layered, complex film where we have many different characters that form a kind of tableau, a network, a web, if you will, of interconnectivity. And the way in which that web of interconnectivity exists and is established by Yang is very intricate, very artistically woven. It is quite delicate, very subtle, and sometimes the connections can be so subtle that one can miss them almost outright. And this is true for his other films as well, but it's certainly true for this film, Mahjong. We do also get a kind of discussion of urban living, and it's probably safe to say that more or less we are dealing with a fairly wealthy subsection or sector of society. Middle class, definitely. Perhaps we can say even upper middle class. These are all working characters in the sense that they have jobs and occupations and ways to make money, although I would suggest that there is a certain bent or spin that Edward Yang applies to this notion that makes this film quite different from the other urban living films that we saw in Edward Yang's past filmography, a la That Day on the Beach, or Taipei Story, or Terrorizers, or Confusion. I guess while we're on that point, let me just try to expand on that to the best of my ability. And again, this is my own comment. I speak not as an expert in Taiwan cinema or Taiwan history. I'm speaking merely as an admirer of Edward Yang's films and his genius. And so with that caveat out of the way, let me just state that it seems to me that when we're talking about the exploration of, let's say, the working class, the middle class or the upper middle class, the well-to-do class here, we are dealing with a discussion or an exploration of this theme that is at once similar to, but also different from, how we've seen these themes worked out in past films. I would argue that here in Mahjong, we have characters that are working and that have they're economically speaking anyway, quite well off and perhaps quite prosperous. But there is a sense, perhaps, of something not being quite right with this kind of capitalistic, consumeristic society that is being depicted here. What it might mean? Well, for example, we have the characters of, let's say, Marcus and Ginger. Ginger is a very apparently wealthy woman, a successful working woman, but we've come to find out that she probably has certain ties with running an escort service or prostitution ring here in Taipei. So that has elements of, let's say, a kind of not completely legitimate line of work. Okay. Then we have Marcus, who is here. Apparently he has a kind of a successful career, but we learn through the film that he was unable to find work in London, or perhaps there were some other suspicious reasons for which he was unable to find work in London. And so he's come here to Taiwan. His motives that we discover are not at all, let's say, generous, but in fact they seem to be almost nefarious. His motives seem to be almost like he's come here to plunder all the money that he sees stashed away here in Taiwan and Taipei. He sees it as being for the taking, as it were. And so he seems to be a plunderer. He seems to be someone who is coming from outside of Taiwan, wanting to take advantage of the situation and to run away with as much money as possible. He seems therefore to be a kind of gold digger, if you will. And even by the way his character is painted as a potential love interest for Marthe, and also as the boyfriend of Allison, he isn't painted in the most sympathetic light all of the time. In fact, for most of the time, I would say he's painted in a less than sympathetic light. It's very easy for a viewer to not like him at all. And so I think that lends itself very nicely to the interpretation of the film, that this film is dealing with the capitalistic society in which the well-to-do class is working. But although there might be economic prosperity, there seems to be an undercurrent of a lack of legitimacy, a lack of good motive, and perhaps even a darker element, which we'll get to in a moment. So that darker element, I would say, is further enhanced by the characters of Redfish and also his gang, and as well as Redfish and his father, Winston. So those are two key blocks that fuel this interpretation that I'm trying to suggest here, namely that this is painting a kind of dark underbelly of the urban consumerism, capitalistic consumerism of Taiwan. We're dealing with Redfish's gang. Under the leadership or stewardship of Redfish, they basically engage in swindling and frauds. We see them dealing with almost a level of petty crime, creating accidents such as ramming into Jay's pink Mercedes, or trying to run amok with a certain apartment building with involving a woman who's named Angela, who's a very key character, in an attempt to try to play upon the beliefs of these people. You know, this idea of fortune telling, and the idea of fate, and if things come to fruition, therefore that might mean more prosperity on the part of Redfish. So it's a sort of scam that he seems to be running with Little Buddha pretending to be this kind of guru or a fortune teller, and thus the gang creates these accidents in order to give the illusion that fortune or future predictions are indeed coming true, such as the pink Benz getting into an accident, or an accident befalling Angela and her car outside of her apartment building, etc. So these all form part of the scheme of Redfish and his gang. And because they're based in fraud, swindling, petty crime, this is certainly not in any way, I think, a positive exploration on the part of Yang with respect to this young youth culture and the way that they are making a living, making money. They're not making money through regular, steady 9-to-5 jobs. No, they are basically cheating other people. While it's played, of course, for laughs in some respects, For instance, how the character of Jay, the person who owns the hair salon, perhaps his story might be played a little bit for laughs or light comedic touch. I would say that the story is drawn out to a conclusion that is very dark. And I can say this because I rely upon the arc of the main head of this group, Redfish. And the arc of Redfish is hooked into the key relationship that Redfish has. The key relationship that he has, I would argue, is not with his gang, although his gang is very close to him. It is not with his mother, although I would assume that his mother is very close he is close to his mother as well. I would argue that the key relationship is that with his father, Winston. And this is very true, I think, because they seem to be having very similar lives, or at least Redfish seems to be living his life the way he sees his father having lived his life when he was younger. This idea of taking things, taking the initiative. Redfish seems to be echoing a kind of a work ethic or a viewpoint of living. People don't, I'm paraphrasing, people don't know what they want. They have to be told what they want. So he seems to have a kind of take charge attitude that is bordering on the lines of, you have to think of yourself. So there's an element of selfishness there, but it's also selfishness that is immune from any sense of morality. And Redfish even admits as much. He admits that this idea of morality will cloud one's judgment, and one cannot be too compassionate. It'll get in one's way. And his way that we see throughout most of the film is money, and the acquisition of money, the getting of money. And this mirrors beautifully the story of the father, Winston. And we understand that Winston, at the start of the film, the father is in much money trouble indeed. He seems to have debts way over his head, about $100 million that he owes to gangsters. And so basically the mob or the gangsters are after him, trying to get their money back. So he is in hiding. So in fact, this lifestyle of trying to get more money on the part of the father has led to a kind of financial ruin. But at the same time, his son is following the same path, and we see his son at a very young age. The assumption is that he is 17 or 18. He's just starting out in his life of crime, petty crime as it were. But he seems to be making the most of it, at least in the short term. So he seems to think that this is the way to live one's life. Okay. These two roads lead to very dark places, as we know from seeing the film. With the father, it leads to death by his own suicide. And he dies in the arms of his, we assume to be, lover. So it's kind of a love-packed suicide, based in part on the fact that he is on the run for all the money that he owes. But also perhaps it might be something of a kind of an act of compassion or serenity. And we know this because Winston admits early on when he's talking to his son that after he has accumulated all this wealth, he realized that the things he wanted were things he couldn't buy. And that's a kind of mysterious comment to make, but it's suggestive of the fact that money indeed cannot buy happiness. And if that's the case for Winston, we can assume that the road down this path of getting more money and getting more riches probably did not lead ultimately to happiness. I'm not sure exactly. I mean, it certainly led to death, which is a pretty dark place indeed in the context of the film. And so we can see the seeds of Redfish's own destruction in the way that his father's story plays out. I mean, his father's story plays out in quite scary terms and quite tragic terms in terms of death. So Redfish's story must parallel that story as well. And indeed, Redfish's story does parallel this, as we know. He gets involved with the scheme trying to get back at this woman named Angela, who's the woman who is part of this apartment building thing, and he's trying to get back at her because he thinks that this is the woman who swindled his father out of money way back in the day. Angela. Well, it's a tragic thing that he gets this way confused in his head, to the point where he is so bereft and he is without any moral anchor to weigh him down, even at the point where his life is most chaotic, which is the point where he discovers his father's dead body. There's no other room for him except in a downward spiral, which leads to the shocking burst of violence against the businessman, Mr. Chu, and the shocking revelation that Angela was not the Angela that he thought that Angela was. So we leave Redfish alone, bereft, and his life totally destroyed, because not only did he follow this path of an amoral life on the path of trying to get as much money as possible through swindling and petty crime, but ultimately, in the end, I think he realizes that this way of life is meaningless. Is absolutely meaningless, because not only did it lead nowhere fruitful on the part of his father, but with respect to Mr. Chu and the Angela storyline, it led to a place that was completely false. It completely upended his entire understanding and his entire worldview up to that point. And so if that isn't a dark commentary on this notion of urban city living and making a living and economic prosperity in the then contemporary modern day Taiwan or Taipei, I don't know what is. It is a brilliantly poetic, tragically charged way in which Edward Yang is depicting this crust of society. It's not all doom and gloom, of course. We do get these glimpses, as I say, of comic touches that still have an undercurrent of a sinister touch to them. I would point to the scenes involving Little Buddha, also the scenes involving Hong Kong and his sort of way with women that leads to a very peculiar end to his particular arc, where he's this man who is so self-confident and so sexually confident and has such a way with the women, in the end just cannot stop crying because of the certain situation that he finds himself in with the Angela character, and the tables are turned on his particular character, and I'll get to that in a second. There are also not only those comedic touches, but there is also, at the core of this particular film, the story, the core, the relationship here is between Marthe, on the one hand, who is the young girl who has just come from Paris trying to find her boyfriend Marcus, and also Runrun, the young man, the newest member of the gang, of Redfish's gang. So Runrun is serving as the interpreter, the translator between the Mandarin-speaking characters here, or the Chinese-speaking characters here on the one hand, and also the English-speaking characters on the other hand, or specifically Marthe. So he is the translator between Marthe on the one hand and the rest of the characters on the other hand, or Ginger, etc. And so he serves a kind of practical function within the narrative. But this also gives him a glimpse into both worlds, so to speak, if we are to consider the two worlds as being different worlds. It also gives him a glimpse into the character of Marthe and her story. And through that, we as viewers, as the audiences, get into the story between Marthe and and Runrun. So this, I think, forms the emotional core of this film. We root for these characters. In particular, we root for Runrun because we see in him a kind of moral center that is absent from the rest of the gang. We certainly see this when he seems to be the most hesitant when the young girl Allison comes to the place, and there's discussion about how all the guys in the gang are going to share this woman, which is a really kind of horrific concept. But Runrun seems to be the only one who doesn't want to be a part of this. He's whether it's an expression of shyness or whether it's a deeper expression of his own morality. I would say it's the latter, perhaps a little bit of the former mixed in as well. But undoubtedly, Runrun is the moral center of this film. He is the moral center of this film because he is trying to do the best for Mart. He sees a dangerous world for Mart. He certainly sees danger before Mart does when he understands that the gestures from Ginger and also the gestures from Redfish are merely ruses in order to ultimately ensnare Mart into some kind of prostitution ring. For Ginger, it's and Runrun is and Redfish as well, and these are quite nefarious motives indeed. Runrun knows this, and so he really wants to save her in a way from this world. And maybe there's a certain innocence about her character, and we realize that she's actually much tougher than she might seem to us to be, let me put it that way. And she shows her resilience and her sharp intelligence, in fact, in the dealings with the gangsters, the two gangsters. I mean, she's very quick on her feet, and she's the one who gets themselves out of that situation. And that's not Runrun. I mean, she's the one who does it. So it's an amazing feat. She also has a core of innocence, and she also is very, I would say, emotionally. She has an emotional richness to her. I mean, that lovely scene where she is seen crying after having freed herself from the gangsters is a real touching moment, I think. It shows that she is not. She has a side to her that I think is can be prone to being scared. It can be prone to being quite jittery as well, and I think not surprisingly so, because it was a really intense situation that she found herself in together with Runrun. So yes, so I think that her and Runrun form the moral compass in this world that is perhaps otherwise amoral, and it's very important, therefore, to that. The film focuses on them, the film follows them, it sort of weaves back and forth, they seem to drift apart, then come back together. Then there is a proclamation, not necessarily of love, but a real devotion on the part of Runrun towards the end. Mart seemingly rejects him in favor of Marcus. So, but at the end, of course, we know that ultimately Mart runs away from Marcus, and she and Runrun are together. Now, the film ends on this rather poignant note of the two of them together and kissing and embracing on the night streets. I would question whether this is really a kind of optimistic point. Don't get me wrong. I think the fact that they're together, I think, is a very optimistic gesture, broadly speaking. But then I wonder, will this couple really survive in this otherwise bleak world that has been painted before our very eyes over the course of these 2 hours? Query whether that is indeed possible. Who knows? It might be possible. I certainly hope it's possible. I'm rooting for them, and even now I root for them. I hope that after the film is over, I hope that they are still a couple, because I think they form the one bright light in this otherwise dimly lit world. So that's, I would say, the first main part of the film in terms of the way in which Edward Yang is depicting the city life and the city life of working people, and whether or not they are emotionally happy along with being economically prosperous. I mean, that's a question that is up to us, the viewers, as we see. But I think all signs point to the interpretation that while there might be economic prosperity, there is very little when it comes to emotional satisfaction. From there, I think the film deals on another level with this notion of a depiction of Taiwan and Taipei and the society writ large at this time, 1996. Whether you want to paint it in terms of modern development, in terms of economic prosperity of a society as a whole, in terms of development on a democratic scale, on a societal democratic scale, democracy. All these, and also in terms of modern development, I think all these things come together on a broad spectrum. And this is something that we have seen dealt with in past Edward Yang films. We've certainly seen this in Taipei Story. We've certainly seen this in That Day on the Beach. But here we are in 1996, so we are in slightly different times in terms of the history of Taiwan, the history of democracy in Taiwan, and also the history of urban development in Taiwan. In particular, specifically speaking, as a kind of metaphor, the trains, the matela. Right, martyr, matela. So these things all come together and try, I think, painting a portrait of or a snapshot, if you will, of Taiwan in the midst of, or at least on the cusp of, a kind of a stage of its own urban development and also, societally speaking, development in terms of democratic principles and ideals applied to society in practice. But even in those terms, I would submit for your attention that this film, maybe albeit obliquely, still deals with these themes in a maybe satirical tone or cynical tone. What do I mean by this? Well, I think on the one hand, we see notions of, let's say, democratic ideals turned on their head and almost made fun of, or almost satirized in a way that is not only comic, but also quite relevant. For example, I return to Redfish's outlook on life. Namely, he is quoted as saying, it's not, people don't know what they want. They have to be told what they want. And this is, of course, in the context of his own life plans and swindling and trying to get money from people in these sorts of illegitimate means, of course. But I think it could also be a comment on a kind of warped sense of a democratic ideal, right? Because if we think of one of the democratic bedrock principles being this idea of self-will, of making one's own decision, and maybe voting with your based on what you want. The fact that he makes this philosophy his own is it's a warped sense of democracy, if you will. It's not like people have their own volition and make their own choices, but on the contrary, he's saying that people need to be told what they want, which is seems to me to be quite antithetical to this notion of democratic free will. Another example, I think, where there is a bit of satire or cynicism at play is the notion of the gang, the four Redfish, Hong Kong, Little Buddha, and Lun Lun, but maybe less so the fourth, but these three in particular. They want to share the latest one-night stand of Hong Kong, that is Allison, the girlfriend of Marcus. Now this is quite a weird and almost, it's a real frightening concept actually, that Hong Kong brings the girl home and they spend the night together, and then the next morning they wake up and the other gang members are there. And so there's this idea that In order to show their friendship and their close bond, they want to share everything, including the women that they sleep with. So this seems to me to be, and on the one hand, it's sometimes played for comic effect, but it's also a very frightening concept. It seems to me also to be, at least potentially speaking anyway, a kind of commentary, if you will, on this, again, warped sense of majority rule. Perhaps it can be seen also as this really weird or warped sense of communal living, commune, shared assets. And I think the commentary is even further made complicated by the fact that Allison, the young woman in question, while she seems to be a bit, at first anyway, repelled by the idea of having sex with, let's say, little Buddha or any of the others, she doesn't appear to be totally abhorrent to the idea. She doesn't seem to be totally repellent. In other words, she doesn't like the idea, but she eventually goes along with the idea in order to appease Hong Kong, and she's very much infatuated with Hong Kong at this particular moment in time, of course. So the fact that she seems to go along with this notion of this really upended sense of majority rule, if you will, is, I think, yet another spin or a twist on the commentary, albeit, again, oblique one, on the kind of democratic principle of majority rule. And I think her reaction, plus, of course, the way in which the men here portray themselves, maybe Lun much less so, but the other three, is, I think, a warped, almost corrupted version of this democratic principle. And it highlights further this notion that we are living in a kind of moralless world, or an amoral world. And if it weren't for the existence of Runun, I think it would be quite a dark world indeed. So, yes, we are dealing, I think, with this second level of, let's say, Taiwan writ large. And when we think of Taiwan in this particular stage in its history, 1996, I think we can see that there are at least some attempts here to link it to a kind of broader picture, which is very typical of Edward Yang's approach, as we have seen in his past works, quite strongly so. Also, if we can think back, let's say, to the first point that I was making, the first broad theme of, let's say, modern living. Of course, contrasted with that is this idea of, let's say, old-fashioned values, the values of importance of familial connections, the kinds of things that we might, maybe broadly speaking, or maybe in a narrative sense, associate with notions of empathy, love, emotional bonds, emotional connections, the importance of these. Well, as I tried to suggest maybe in the earlier part of this video, I think that for the most part, the world that is painted here is a world that is without morals, or without characters that have a moral compass or center, except maybe for Runrun, and perhaps even to a certain degree Mart. But for the most part, I would say that there is a lack of moral center. Not to say that these are bad characters, mind you. I think we are dealing with a world, again, the characters of Ginger and Marcus, I think, describe it as being the wild, wild west. And I think it's in many ways, that is a very apropos description, because we are dealing with characters that don't seem to have a kind of a function in, let's say, a traditional family sense. The only family that we ever see in the traditional sense of the word is the mother and father and son of the Chen family, Redfish, and the mother of Redfish and the father of Redfish accordingly. Those relationships tend to be, I think, or it's not the focus of the film. Or let me take that back. One of the strong foci of the film, of course, is the relationship between father and son, which is one of the key relationships, right, in family, as we can all, I think, identify with. It is, I would say, quite a weird relationship, because there is an undercurrent of illegitimacy in terms of business dealings. There's also, of course, the undercurrent of illegitimacy in terms of Redfish's own swindles and frauds. He basically is a petty criminal, or petty thief. And his worldview seems to be adopted from the way he thinks that his father lived his own life. And so there's a sense that both father and son have this strain of illegitimacy about the way in which they want to live their own lives. But it's strangely played out too at the same time, because their stories are parallel. And also, it's through this act of acting like a swindler or a petty thief that, in a weird way, Redfish is showing his respect for his father. He's basically following in his father's footsteps, or at least the way he sees it. And in that sense, we can see this as being a real twisted, yes, but still a fundamentally pure form of sort of father-son allegiance, or a son being devoted to the father. And if that isn't a strong Confucian ideal, I don't know what is. And so, in this very odd way, that feels in many ways wrong, or maybe immoral, or maybe even unnatural, perhaps, there is undoubtedly a strong undercurrent of a deep bond that is, I think, a primal father-son relationship. Again, as I mentioned before, it ends rather tragically, of course, but for the two of them. But still, it is there. So I'm not sure how to make of this. Is this, on the one hand, Edward Yang telling us that this is like a bright spot in an otherwise dark world? Or is this Edward Yang saying that even these seemingly strong familial bonds are inherently themselves corrupted? I don't know what to make of that. One is more maybe positive, one is much more cynical. I'd like to think it's the lesser cynical of the two, but I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. It's a very interesting dynamic, of course, and again, one that plays out in the context of this discussion of modern living, modern life. Where is emotion in this world? Is there room for emotion? Perhaps in the story of Hong Kong and what eventually happens to him, the tables are turned, right? When he is confronted by Angela and her party of friends, and they want to share him amongst themselves, right? It's the kiss, well, for him maybe the kiss of death, or the kiss of bad fortune, as Little Buddha might put it. But in any event, it leads to him breaking down and crying, and he loses his mojo, so to speak. So these sorts of unnatural relationships where there is no room for love or emotional commitment breaks down even the most seemingly of hardened characters, like Hong Kong seems to be. And so that seems to be also to be this another great commentary on this idea of, again, described in broad strokes, this notion of where is the place of emotion and emotional links between human beings. Where is this place? Where does this fit in this society that's being painted by Edward Yang here? Does it exist, or can it coexist with this otherwise cold world that's being painted here? Or is it virtually impossible for the two of them to coexist? Perhaps if we were to go up through the story arcs of Hong Kong and then, of course, Redfish, perhaps the answer to that question would be that there is no possibility of coexistence between the modern city living on the one hand and the notion of the importance of emotional bonds between human beings on the other hand, in the context of this grand way of society that's being portrayed in this film. If we were to end on those two character arcs, the conclusion would undoubtedly be there is no possibility. But the film doesn't end there, right? That's the most fascinating thing. The film ends with the union, the connection that is made between one character and the other. That between Rundun on the one hand and Mart on the other hand. One character is in many ways an outsider, a complete outsider to this world that is being painted. In many ways, they are both outsiders in this world. If we are to consider this world to be the world that is lacking in a moral center, in that case, I would say both of them are equally as outside of this world. So, in many ways, they belong to each other. And in many ways, that could lead to the hopeful interpretation that I was trying to suggest earlier in this video, namely that their union, while of course filled with doubt and uncertainty about what the future may hold for the two of them, given the world that we see them occupying, there is still room for hope, and there's still room for optimism. And as I say, Edward Yang could have ended this film any way he wanted, but he chose to end it this way. That is a great statement, if ever there was one, I think. So, this is the film Couples, or Mahjong, by Edward Yang, and these are just my comments in a nutshell. Again, I don't speak as an expert in Taiwanese cinema. I don't speak as an expert in Edward Yang films. I don't speak as an expert in Taiwanese history, but I do speak as an admirer of this film. I do know that maybe some parts of this film are seen by some critics and some viewers as being weak. Perhaps some people in particular see the performances by the European actors to be not so strong. And on the one hand, I can see that. On the other hand, I think that their seemingly weak performances actually fits in rather nicely into this tableau, in the sense that they are indeed outsiders in this world that is being painted. And also, there is a kind of a stiffness in the way that they're communicating, which I think it played itself out very nicely in the fact that, if we recall, right, communication is one of the strong themes in this film, or one of the narrative tools in this film at least, that becomes a thematic tool, a thematic device. And if we think of the lack of clear human communication between characters as being one way in which this idea of the city malaise or city living malaise is being exemplified, or the idea of a breakdown between modern urban living on the one hand and moral human connection on the other hand. If we can see the lack of communication as being an exemplar of this kind of breakdown between these two very separate poles, then we can see, therefore, that the act of communication between Runrun on the one hand and Marta on the other hand is a real link. It's not only a link between two distinct separate worlds, but it's also a link that we can see, perhaps maybe thematically, again, big picture speaking, can be seen also to be a link between city living on the one hand and human connection on the other hand, which we saw as being perhaps otherwise irreconcilable. So therefore, this idea of communication becomes very important. And in that sense, I think the fact that these the European actors, when they're speaking, have a certain cadence or rhythm to their speech, which seems to be sometimes at odds with the rest of the characters' speech patterns and rhythms. I find that discord to work rather nicely in the context of the narrative of the film, and this idea of things not quite fitting together and things being a little bit off when we're watching them. But through all that discord and all that mess and discomfort, there is a glimmer of hope. And that glimmer of hope comes in, I think, the ultimate final message, or the final image or shot of the film that Edward Yang leaves us with. That is the union of these two characters here. And so in that general sense, I think that even what might be considered to be the weak points of this film can be seen as potentially being quite helpful and beneficial to the narrative. And I would also say that there are some moments in this film that are quite possibly among the most powerful moments in Edward Yang's filmography altogether. I just direct your attention perhaps to the character arc of Redfish. Redfish, I think, is one of the great tragic characters in all of Edward Yang's filmography. that character is immediate, he is brash, but he is also tender and compassionate, but there's he lies about it, but at the same time you can tell that he is not really lying. There is an undercurrent of compassion in him, although he would be the first to deny it, right? And how can we tell that he's compassionate? Well, he's compassionate towards his mother, or at least he shows compassion, or he shows a kind of devotion towards his mother, and he certainly shows a devotion towards his father. So we cannot deny the possibility, at least, that he himself does have some kind of moral center, although he might be the first one to deny it immediately. And so therefore, if we to think about that and his character through those terms, what happens to him at the end of his arc and the sudden flash of violence that he commits is at once shocking, it is brutal, it is bloody, it is so sad, it is depressing, and it is such a poetic and depressing end to such a memorable character that is so complex, so filled with contradiction. And he is frustrating, and he is lovable, and he is also so charming at the same time. You really want to, I feel like I really wanted him to come through in the end. The fact that he doesn't is really what, it's the ultimate heartbreaker for me when I watch this film. And so for that reason, among many other reasons, of course, I think the character of Redfish is quite arguably one of the greatest characters, most memorable characters in all of Edward Yang's canon. So in many ways, this film holds a lot of riches and great things, and it can potentially be a rich and rewarding experience. How it holds up with the rest of Edward Yang's filmography, I mean, that's a different question entirely, because we are dealing with such a strong filmography, as you know. Edward Yang's films are, I think for the most part, all of them are masterpieces. And so where does this fall? It might fall maybe on the lower end or the mid-tier, but we're still talking about a masterpiece. And so we're talking about a masterpiece when compared to A Brighter Summer Day. Maybe it's not of the same height, but very few films in history are. So even with that, it is still a magnificent work. It is complex, it is flawed, but it is still ultimately so rewarding, and yes, oh so magnificent. This is Edward Yang's Couples, or Mahjong, from 1996. Okay, my friends, let me end it there. And if you have any thoughts or comments about Mahjong or Couples, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. I would love to hear what it is you have to say. Other than that, my friends, that's it. So thank you very much for your time, as always. Next time, I will be talking about the film Yi. So I hope to see you there. In the meantime, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well. And please, please, please keep on watching a lot of great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, cheers and 再见.